this is specifically what my goal specifically designed, and this is to teach people how to actually find the information you need, because exploit that's working today is going to be patched tomorrow, most likely, and there's going to be 2 new 0 days that are dropped tomorrow that will, if you know what you're doing and you know where to find the information, you can continuously stay ahead of the curve. If you're solely relying on tools and solely relying on, this exploit has worked hundreds of times, you're going to fall behind the curve and you'll never be able to consistently get into systems and consistently break systems.
All right, we're good to go.
Good? Okay, great. So, kind of scenario here that we're going to assume, we already have some level of access. Either we've got a web shell and we've injected a VNC session, we sat down at the machine, we've got an RDP session, we've tunneled with like plink.exe, which is a local Windows SSH client, command line client, whatever. We've got some level of shell access that, we're going to be on the machine. Ideally, if you're doing any sort of penetration testing, any sort of exploitation on a Windows machine, if you can get a interactive shell, an RDP session, you're going to be a lot better off. Windows non-interactive command line shells at times will break everything, cause you a lot of problems. The other rule I have up here, if you're working with Windows shells, if you do not have more than 2 shells, you're fucked. You do not want to have to re-exploit. Because a lot of times, once you run your exploit, it kills the service. It crashes it. And if you have not gone in and spawned multiple shells afterwards, if that shell dies for whatever reason, being you accidentally hit Control-C and kill it, and now you're out, you're not getting back in, test, you got to call the client and say, hey, you know what? I fucked up. I killed it. I need back in. And they're going to laugh at you. Or if you're doing this maliciously, well, too bad, so sad. Now, good likelihood you're going to get caught. So, 2 is 1. Always have at least 2 shells. Minimum of 2 shells active at all times on Windows systems when you're doing exploitation. What this isn't, like I said, we're not build any exploits. We're not dropping new exploits. Might get around to a demo or 2 of dropping some old standbys, but likely no. What this is, I'm going to show you how to find what patches are installed, what's missing from a command line. We're going to look at how to see what's running, what's not running. We're going to look at what's actually functional on a Windows machine from a command prompt, so that if you get an actual command shell remotely, and that's all you can get, you can go through a lot of this data. So any questions up front before we get started? Things people would like to see, hear about? Okay, great. Things to remember. Depending on the level of access, you may get power users, you may get some level of administrative access, while other users, a base user, has no access. So, depending on the commands, the stuff we're running, some of it may work, some of it may return information, some of it won't. Be patient. Windows systems are by far, in my opinion, are about 400 to 500 times harder to gain privilege escalation on than a Linux machine. It's just, there's a lot more running, it's a lot more convoluted, and it's just not as simple. Ways to escalate.
So wait, you're saying that the Windows is easier?
It's harder.
Escalate. Oh, it's harder.
Harder. It's about 400 to 500 times, in my opinion, harder to escalate on.
The first time I've heard that Windows is hard as to.
Well, here's the reason I say that. In the good old days of it, you drop an MS7, it's most services, most privileges that are running on a Windows machine are running as an admin. The problem you face now is if you are in a good environment that knows what they're doing and they lock it down, Windows actually becomes very difficult to escalate. Lack of tools. You don't always have Perl, Python, a compiler right there. You don't have a lot of this information, and it's not as easy to just, like I say here, uname-a on a Linux machine. Get your architecture. You get the exact kernel version. You start to get very specific details about the that makes it very easy to attack and exploit. And as in Windows, as in Linux, if you configure your services correctly, they won't run as root, won't run as admin, won't have those privileges. But I'm finding more and more nowadays that Windows machines, if they're configured correctly, they're easy to get in. That's no problem. It's the problem of going from a regular user or a semi-power user to full administrative privileges on a Windows machine can become quite difficult. And that's my opinion. That's what I've seen. The nice thing about Linux is I've got the uname-a. I can start looking at things very quickly. I do a search for that specific kernel version. Oh, okay, now I'm in. I know exactly, it's 3.1.5.7.2. Oh yeah, okay, there's this exploit for it. It needs these environmental things. And, GCC-O, there you go. I've got the down root. But Windows, just if you've got internet up, go search for Windows 7 exploits. Because how do you know which patches you're running, which patches you're not running? And you can't just say Windows 7 because depending upon what patch is applied, your version number never changes. It's never updated. There's one time when the Windows version number is updated. Does anybody know what that is?
Service packs?
Service pack. That is the only time it is done. So, as I said, missing patches, running services that aren't directly reachable. You can take a remote exploit, run it from the same machine, attack 127.0.0.1, and then instead of saying, shell coming back to 127.0.0.1, kick it off elsewhere. This process, but now you're in services. I don't know how many of you have services that get installed, but if you don't very closely check your services after an application's installed, a lot of times there are big holes in those. Running out, whether it be service-based, whether it be scheduled tasks, whether it be, some users running some other application, that's a great place to attack. And if you're lucky, you can steal the creds. That's a harder one to do. You have to have a little bit more access to do it, or you have to find else on the network to steal another place on the network to steal it from, which I'll kind of talk about here in a little bit. And I'm going to apologize up front. These slides suck. I have been swamped with things, so they may not make sense. I may not make sense in my ramblings. And again, that's why I said if you have questions, let me know. Useful commands. This is some of the most information on Windows that even most seasoned Windows administrators don't get into. Windows administrators, and I'm guilty of this, I spent 8 years as a senior Windows architect doing all sorts of fun things. Half these things I tried to avoid like the plague, just because one wrong command, you break everything. First thing, set. How many of you in here have had that command on a Windows machine, the set command?
Give me 1 second.
If you haven't used it, go look at it later. What it'll tell you is things like processor architecture. It'll actually give you, this is an x86 or this is an x64 machine, very clearly. It'll tell you what your authentication server is. Are you authenticated locally? Or are you authenticated against a domain? It'll give you your path. It'll give you the actual extensions that it's automatically going to run. So if you type in on a Windows command prompt or the run, type PowerShell, hit enter, it'll find that and it'll say, oh, okay, this is a PowerShell.exe, immediately run it. That's the set command. System info, let me see if I should have the demo for this up. Nope, I don't. Oh. See a lot of info scroll. This will work on a non-interactive shell. It's best in an interactive shell. You can see here, network. You have the network information right above it. What are all those?
Service packs.
Not specifically service packs.
Your hot fixes.
Your hot fixes. All your different articles that have been applied. Get up here. You can see host information, who makes it, the type of machine, if it's relaying that information from the BIOS. A lot of other good information here. This, the hot fixes though, every one of these are unique and individual. So you can take and search by a KB number, find the actual Microsoft hotfix. They'll say, here's the patch, here's what it covers. Here's what it fixes. So on the reverse, you can actually find, which we'll look at here in a minute, find an exploit and it'd say, oh, this covered under MS 14060 or whatever, or MS 11080. Okay, great. Look at that and you'll see, here's the Microsoft KB number. Come in here and you can see it. See what's applied and what's not applied. NetSH, it is basically a shell for your network commands. You can go in and you can disable your firewall. You can add advanced rules to the firewall. You can do port forwarding. It's actually got a very neat feature that you can do an IPv6 to IPv4 port forwarding natively within Windows. And half the times when the Windows firewall is enabled or configured, they do not do anything with IPv6. So you can open up an IPv6 address and port and have it forward to an IP on IPv4 and bypass the firewall completely. What's that?
So just disable IPv6?
You know, some people do, or actually configure your firewall correctly to block IPv6 addresses. WMIC, there's a lot of information here. Let's pull it up here, WMIC. These are all your old namespaces. How many of you in here have done old VB scripting, you know, pulling hardware level information, BIOS level information from it? Do you? That's where you can pull, this is where you pull this information. You can also set information about this system. You can pull very low level hardware information, system information. You can also update and change system information in here. If you don't have to be in WMIC, especially in the shell where I'm at now, don't. You can do something like, let's go exit this, do a WMIC, quick QFE, quick fix engineering. It's what Microsoft does for all their patches. List, and it'll take it a minute. It'll scroll a bunch of information here. It'll tell you the URL for the patch, what the KB number, you know, when it was applied, what it runs as, etc., etc., etc. We'll kind of cover that a little bit more. But, as I said, if you don't have to be in WMIC in the shell itself, don't. You can always go WMIC space the namespace space /, get information about it. You can do a list and list the information without actually being prompt in that shell.
Why don't you want to be in there?
One wrong command, one wrong typo. I've seen BIOSes get borked. I've seen system info get borked. I've seen processor information. System doesn't run right. I've killed machines playing around in there. So it's one of those kind of things, kind of like root on a Linux machine. You know, you typo the wrong thing, you do an rm-rf space / and don't actually append the period, you're going to kill the whole system. You know, things like that. Useful set commands. Path, set path. So we'll dive into these commands them specifically. You know, the set path, set your logon server. This will also tell you, let me preface this. Anytime you see a PowerShell here, it's actually running from a CMD prompt. The reason I do that is things like your set, other Windows commands, if you try to run it in a PowerShell prompt, will not run. because they're reserved in PowerShell or they have special features within PowerShell, it'll break it. But if you do a PowerShell space and double quote it and give it your PowerShell command, however much you want to do, and then close your quotes, it will actually run it as a PowerShell script and return back to the command prompt, and it'll bypass all your script restrictions for PowerShell. So you type everything out, take a big long script, type it all out like this, you can run it from a command prompt and bypass those restrictions. Because I mean, how many of you in here that do Windows administration work actually go in and set your restrictions so that it's restricted, or they have to be signed scripts so that you can't just take and download any old script from the internet and run it? Something to think about. Because if you haven't set it and I'm on your machine, I can run any Windows PowerShell, do whatever I want. If you set it and sign to be signed, it has to be assigned with a known key, or it has to be a trusted key within from your own internal PKI infrastructure. Those. But as I said, logon server tells you if you're on a domain, what domain controller you're authenticated to, which will, from a local perspective, don't care it's a domain, what domain controller I'm authenticated to, but it will tell me, okay, this is on a domain. The account I have domain privileges, maybe a domain user, something for me to know, so that once I conquer this machine, I can use the information I have here to continue to spread out across the network. Any questions, comments? No? Okay. Version. Like I said, Unix, Linux, you name -A. Tells you everything you need to know. Very simple, very straightforward. However, Windows, here, I'll show you. CLS, ver. Who can tell me what version of Windows that is specifically by that number?
Windows 7,
What service pack?
Service Pack 1.
What edition of Windows 7?
Professional.
It's the ultimate because I saw it previously.
That
Okay, so I mean, that doesn't give you a lot of information, does it? Not very useful trying to find an exploit. Doesn't tell you anything about patches, specific version numbers. So, as you said, 7601 here, as you said, Service Pack 1. Previously, Windows 7600, you're running without Service Pack 1. So, a machine I have here, $7,600. We're running a base Windows install. Is it still picking it up, Denny?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I didn't wanted to make sure it didn't pick it up when I switched to VM.
It's
Okay.
picking up everything off screen to the right too, but yeah.
Okay. Whoops. Okay.
No, it's not.
So, if you ever see one that you don't know, Wikipedia has actually got a very good comparison. I'll grab this link and show you guys. Wasn't sure if I was going to have network or not tonight. So you can see your 9X, your NT. Here's everything since XP moving forward has been on the NT line. So you can start to see your build numbers, major versions, specific details about them. 3790s versus 2600, 2003 versus XP. This is where it starts to get a little bit more convoluted. Is all of Windows Vista and Server 2008 pretty much are going to be the same build numbers. And then you get down to Windows 7. If you look over here, how many different versions does that build number cover? Professional, Ultimate, Starter, Home, whatever else you want to say. And same thing with 2008 R2. It's the exact same build numbers that you'll see. The only difference is Is it 7600 or 7601? Not a lot of details. However, through the love, the good things about PowerShell, let's go. Whoops, now, not to the VM. Yeah.
Service pack.
Service pack, what else? Version. Specific OS version. Ultimate versus professional versus starter. So, if you're doing any sort of Windows penetration testing, trying to break it, PowerShell is going to be your friend. It's got access to all the WMI, low-level stuff. It's got full access to the .NET backend. It's got just a wide capability, and it's a lot more versatile and more flexible than, let's say, Bash on a Linux machine. And it's a lot more robust and powerful. It's got because it's got that full .NET backend. Windows patches. This is where the biggest problem that people have with Windows testing is patches. How do you know what to find? And so with a Linux machine, I look up the version, I look at what's running. Oh, okay, I can do a specific Google search for that. I will find what I need. Okay, yes, it's got an exploit. No, it doesn't. I move on. I start looking for other things. Windows, if I do a search for Windows 7 Ultimate exploits or Windows 7 Professional exploits, there's such a large variety. What you have to do is actually search and start going through them one by one. Here, this is a way to see what you have installed, and this gives you a good cross-reference. You need to take the process really is once you pull down what patches you have installed, go search, go look at Security Focus or Exploit DB or whatever other site you use for pulling down vulnerabilities, pulling down exploits. Look through them one by one and say, okay, you know what? This one says this is related to this KB. Go check your list of what you've got installed. Say, is this KB installed? Yes or no? It is? Shit. Move to the next one. Is it not? Okay. Let's build it. Let's compile it. Let's make sure it's going to work. Let's upload it. Let's put it on the machine. Execute. And hopefully, if you're lucky, you've got the shell that you executed it from is actually now administrative privileges. Here's an example of one. So I've got this already up. Search, Windows 7 exploits. Covers Vista SP2, Server 2008, Server 2008 R2, I believe is covered. Windows 7, Exchange Server. Okay, great. Find this now. You got to go back the next step and do a CVE number. Okay, great. You can look at either may or may not tell you what it is, but you come in here, do a search on the CVE for Microsoft. There you go. You've got the MS number. You got more information. You also have generally speaking, it will be here. That's your KB number. At the end of that. That's what you want to look for. Is this KB number? What's the KB? The other thing I always look for, is there an exploit? Sure enough, we got an exploit. It's built into Metasploit, right there. So, how do I know if this one would actually work or not?
See if the computer's been patched.
So, what would you guys do upon what I've been saying? Start looking for this.
System info.
System info. That's one way to do it.
One that compiled.
Let's go take a look and see if let's see if this machine's been patched.
Throw stuff at the wall until it sticks.
What's that? Thankfully, I already know the answer to this. I'd be ashamed of myself if I didn't.
Also, for the sake of us, I hope it isn't.
It is.
Is it?
That's
It
number
is.
188.
188 right there?
There.
Yep. So this reason right here alone is why I say Windows exploitation and escalation is so difficult. Because there's not a straight path to find what you need. You've got to jump through multiple hoops to actually find what you're looking for. And it's a trial and error. So if I were trying to pop this machine, I'd be back to the drawing board looking for my next exploit, looking for the next thing I could potentially go track back down to these patches. There are a couple of tools that are out there. They're written in Python and then been compiled back over to an exe. Problem is non-interactive shells, and about half the time it fails to run because the way it was compiled and built was for the old 16-bit subsystem, so that you could actually use the thunk. I think it's thunk.exe that was built on the older systems that would allow 16-bit native applications to run. It gets scary, and up until I think 2008, Vista in 2008, you could still do that. 2008 R2, Windows 7 do not natively have that ability to run these 16-bit applications. So you run some of these tools, and it just craps out and says, I can't access this. I do not have the memory allocation and the memory pointers to be able to get to this. You're left kind of high and dry, and a lot of it kills your shell. That's the other reason I always say, have more shells. Obviously, with what I'm doing here, I'm kind of showing it, logged into the machines, and that. I'm not going to kill the shell. I'm not going to make it so I can't log in. But if this was actually, a pen test, or I was on the network and I hadn't been able to successfully get an interactive GUI shell to run some of these things, and I screw that up, as I said, I'm kind of left high and dry. So, not installed. It's a win. All right, this one, if it's not installed, it's a win. You can download, compile the executable. You can, if it's a Metasploit module, drop an interpreter shell. If you're in an interpreter shell, background it, use a Windows Post exploitation module, have it run against that session. Now you've got admin privileges. It spawned up a new shell. But thankfully for me, this one's that. Services. This is the other one that most admins don't ever find, don't ever know to look for, look at. So when you start a service, right, in Windows, default, kind of what does it run as? Who does it run as? System.
Or the local user.
You've got system, network, and there's one other. The third one I don't remember off the top of my head. But generally speaking, network and system, local system, are the two primary ones that you'll see. With those accounts, if you can get a service level account, it's game over. You've got full access to that machine. However, if I'm sat down at a machine, I'm not going to be actively, Nmap scanning it. I'm not going to be trying to run a Nessus or a net against it, enumerate and look at everything. It's just not feasibly possible. So a couple of things to look for. Services, you want to find the ones that are running. You want to know their name and their, the actual name of it and their path name. So let's grab this and I'll show you.
There's network service, and then there's the local system account and the local service account.
Yes, thank you.
That's why, I always.
So. I forget. I was just running this earlier today. What? Where am I missing Anybody see it? Where I'm missing a quote?
The copy and paste might change your tick type.
You're probably right. I hate that.
Well, the fact that there are 2 ASCII characters for double quote.
There we go. So as you can see here, I want to see, so here's just the name of your services that are running right now, right? Here's the paths to them. Can anybody see the difference on these? Tell me what's going on. The difference in these paths. Oh, whoops.
Some that are
System
upper
32
case and some are lower.
No, it's not case related.
Program file.
It's not location related.
What's the
Quotes. Some are quoted because you've got obviously some spacing. And this is a fairly default machine. I don't have a ton running on it, but I have seen this happen several times. People will screw up and not quote where their services are executed out of. And as an attacker, so let's say, for example, C program files, x86, NVIDIA, whatever. If they don't quote it, I can create a C program and drop an executable in there with the same name as what the service is looking for. And a lot of times, it goes to execute. If it's not configured correctly, we'll actually program first instead of running what's actually the full path.
Can you shoot me the command you just used?
I'll actually share all the commands, the information
All right.
here a little bit later.
This is just a comment on YouTube.
Oh, what?
I just wanted the command that you just used on YouTube. Oh well.
Right there. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing you got to know about services, how many of you have ever actually sat down and looked at, after you install an application, what the permissions on the directory are? I'm gonna throw a scenario out, and I want you to think about it, and then I'll explain the reasoning why. You go out to, Corp XYZ, download their latest widget, install it, starts the service, so you get your nice little pop-up on your window, right? Tells you, hey, your coffee's done, right? Hooks up to your network coffee maker. Coffee's done, coffee's ready. Everything's good to go. You don't check your permissions. On there, you've got network level app. It's reaching outbound, so it's not accepting any. It reaches out, pulls, comes back. Permissions on the folder, everybody has full access. They didn't set their permissions correctly. What possibly could happen if everybody has full access to that directory or has changed permissions on that directory?
replace an executable?
An executable. You could patch an executable so that when it starts up, it starts your widget, but at the end of your executable, it now spawns an interpreter shell back to your attack box. Or you replace a DLL so that when the executable runs, tries to call the DLL, nope, not going to happen. And what happens there is it will call the DLL, it'll run what's in the DLL, crash the application, but now whatever code was in that DLL has been executed. So just out of curiosity, what kind of fun things could you do if you had an unrestricted access to a DLL that you could change into whatever you wanted to?
I mean, with the shared library, you could do all sorts of stuff.
Don't even need it to be a shared library. Since you've got access to the file,
You could launch it, yeah. You can launch the library.
more so than that, you can DLL, you've got your code, you can write whatever code you want. So now, instead of being, that this is the network stack for this DLL, it now says, I want you to add this user, give them this permissions, I want you to spawn a shell back to this. I'm hard coding in here a crypto locker attack, encrypt your entire drive. I have access, you don't. Now, if you want back in, you gotta pay me however much for you to get back in. So think about that. So if you don't check your permissions, it could very easily be a way to get in. And like some of the more advanced malware, some of the exploits out there, what we'll do is instead of replacing the DLL completely, we'll pull the DLL down, we'll recode it, and we'll patch it and append, basically say instead of being just the network stack, we'll append the interpreter shell or the command to add our user to the machine to this DLL. So when it runs, it kicks it off and away it goes, and I walk away. Now I've got access and I have not done anything else to the machine. And I mean, few bite size and difference for that little bit of code. How hard is that going to be to actually track down from a malware or a forensics perspective? I know we got a couple of guys in here that do malware and forensics type of work. How hard is that to track down unless you know the former hash of a machine of that specific DLL?
Or if you don't have the former hash, then yes, that would be a pain in the butt.
And how do you know that called executable is what actually triggered the user ad?
Off the top of my head.
Dan, what do you think?
It's going to log it somewhere.
You sure?
Well, probably.
Depends on what their settings on the system are.
Settings on the system. Now, let's say I want to be a real pain in the ass. So, decaf. What did we say earlier that services like this generally run as?
They can run as service or system or network.
So what with system level privileges, how hard is it to tell Windows Event Viewer to stop logging?
Very easy.
Stop it, corrupt the log files, run your thing, restart it. Windows will repair its log files, or say, you know what, it's been overwritten. Or like said, you want to know a real good way to hide something in the logs? Go in and reconfigure the logs to override after 10 megs. Start Windows updates. What happens with Windows updates? Everything is logged, every action. At that point, well, good luck finding it. Hopefully you've got some memory dump, some way to actually capture that information before it's lost. And because if not, at that point, on. Good luck. So when you're looking at your directories, your services, the directories they run out of. So again, all these, look at the permissions. Check every one of them. If you see a C or an F by it for users, that means they have change or full control, which means they can do what they want in that directory. Rename a DLL, put a new DLL in, replace a version. And if you kill the service, and it's not hard to kill a service in Windows, to break something, there you go. Now I've just successfully written, and I'm doing my own thing here.
App Locker.
What's that?
The right App Locker.
App Locker can help.
With the DLL protection.
It can help. It depends on the manufacturer, though, and if everything's been registered. If it's not been registered, if it's not configured correctly, App Locker won't notice. It can be done. And I mean, it's a game of cat and mouse. It's, they take these steps. Well, okay, can I beat App Locker? Can I break it? Can I circumvent it somehow? Can I approach it in another direction? Likely, yes. And it also depends. Is it I'm patching the DLL versus replacing it versus patching the executable. Processes. So same sort of thing, same sort of information. With processes, they'll be running as a user, they'll be running as a service, a network account, whatever. The thing about this is they may not automatically start. So let's say, for example, so this is why you need to check these is, George that you share a system with, or whoever you share a system with, right? If you're unlucky at work, or you're on the machine as that user, he's not running the service, but he's running Firefox 3.6. Because for whatever reason, his porn site that he loves to look at work doesn't display well in the newer Firefoxes or Chrome or that. You're not going to see that as a service. It doesn't start automatically. But that's why you've got to look at the processes. You need to find out what's actually running as those users. So let's take, here's the two different ways you'll see it. If I could type, here's your services. This is what services are actually running, what's registered as with the SVC. Service accounts. Chrome does it, you run DLL, pretty much anything and everything that may need something to start at boot or that needs to have access to escape any of the sandboxing technology that it may need to use, has to register as a service, has to be at low level access. Versus a task, let's do it this way. What is my tag? Yeah, /v. This will tell you who's running it, what user. You can see NT Authority a system, where it's running from the console, from the services, what's happening. Console, unlike in what you hear a lot of times in a Unix environment, console's anybody that's actually logged in to the machine. So it's interactive login. So if I were to spawn a calculator, you'd see it pop up in here under console. Versus a service, which is your services that are actually running. Generally speaking, you'll see an actual username attached to a console, because that's what I'm logged into as the console right now, versus, for example, where's a good one here? Services, NT Authority system. That's your service. That's the stuff that's running low level. That's the stuff that, if you can get those are the ones you want, but you may not have direct access to it. You may have to go for something your user has. Any questions? Anything you're not understanding? Going over people's heads? We good?
Yep.
Great. Network. So you'll see all this information. You'll have found these network services, right? But now this will actually tell you what they're listening on, how to get access to them. Just because. So let's backstep. So you'll find, let's say, Windows, Linux. What's a common, MySQL, right? Common free database server. How many of you in here would allow MySQL to be directly accessible from any host on the network? Well, we know you will, Decaf, but
That's the funnest way.
I know. But yet, how many of you have ever seen an exploit for MySQL? Anybody else besides you? So there have been several exploits to attack MySQL. Anything from UDF library loading, where you executable file as a blob in the database and then have it write it back out to the system as a .so, a shared object file, to just authentication bypasses, things like that. And generally speaking, what does MySQL run as?
MySQL user, if you configured it correctly.
So what does it really run as?
Admin, probably.
Administrator, as a system. It runs with a high level of privileges, generally speaking. So if we know it's running, but yet how do we access it? This is where a lot of people have problems with Windows exploitation as well, because a lot of people don't know how to actually go from, oh, well, I see MySQL's running, but it's not reachable outside the firewall. How do I know what it's listening on? How do I attack it? As I said, you can use a remote exploit and attack 127.0.0.1, kick the shells elsewhere. You can do, instead of having it kick a shell, you can have it spawn a new process. There's a lot of things in that sense. However, that being said, you actually have to find a way to attack it. Whether it be you proxy it, whether you tunnel it, like I said earlier, use like Plink on a Windows machine to do command line SSH and do port forward, whatever.
Can you log back into the wireless? Somebody was being an asshole to the wireless.
Yes, I can log back in.
So
That's my pineapple.
wrong one.
What, is that the wrong one?
Not the one on the wall. That one's DHCP is broken.
Damn it, Lean.
Yeah, I know, right? There we go.
Okay, we're back. Okay. So, first thing you need to check, let's clear this, netstat -ANO. Let me scroll this up a little bit. This information you can always get as any user. It'll give you your local address, remote address, what's listening, what's connected, what ports are open. If it's listening, obviously it's an open port, it's a listening port. Established means you've got the connection, you've got... What's going on? Okay. So, you got things like that. But this will tell you, right here. So, for example, if you look here, a lot of these, well, let's see, where was the listenings? You can see here, it's only listening on 10.10.7.128, port 139, it's listening. So, as with Unix, Linux, anything else, you can configure a lot of your services to either listen on a specific interface, so you got a dual home machine, you can't get access to it. Your firewall, it's listening, but you're only allowing certain ports through. Listening on 127.0.0.1, which is generally speaking the best way to do it if you can. You've got to have a way to attack it. So this will tell you where it's listening, what it's running as. If you have a user that has somewhat of an elevated privilege, you tack the -B on there as well. It'll actually give you the binary path. It'll tell you what's actually running it. So now you know, oh, MySQL is running and listening on 3306 port, 127.0.0.1 port 3306. Okay, great. Now I know, here's the details. Now I've got specifics surrounding that for it. Otherwise, you're just kind of guessing in the dark without knowing. If you don't know, it's just going to be a process of trial and error. Connect to the ports, do what you got to do, figure out what's going on. But the other thing too is, and it may be a little hard to see, your PIDs. Left-hand column or right-hand column. What's useful about that is if you remember, looking at that task list just however many couple of slides ago, you can see your PIDs there. You can start to correlate your PID that's running, what the actual running application is, to what port's open. So if you don't have the ability to run your binary port, you still have your PID. Okay, we know which PID it is. We can look back, start to make that correlation. Start to dive in, okay, are we going to attack one of these applications or not? Okay. And I didn't finish. Shit.
Didn't think you would make it this far?
Honestly, no. And again, as I said, it's been a kind of a chaotic couple of weeks, so given that, once you know this, you could use things like I said earlier. NetSH, go into the firewall, open ports up. You can change the ports if you have some level of access. Even if you're not a full administrator, high-level ports on Windows are the same as high-level ports on Unix. Anything over 1024, a user can open a port for. So at that point, you can attack. You can use that to attack, and do some port forwarding, some port, some magic that way. Like I said, SSH back out. So, and again, network services, and I'm going to go back here. Processes. What did we talk about with services? Permissions, directory permissions, right? How many of you ever took and looked at the application you just downloaded, installed, that you run on a daily basis? Looked at the permissions for that. Can everybody access it? Is it just you? Where's it installed at? What are the permissions? Because if you don't check your permissions on there, same thing. One of my favorite things I did in a class, we actually backdoored no XE. And it was set up to do that. But what would happen is an administrative script that ran that kicked off notepad.exe, had it up for a few seconds, then closed it. So just think about this though. How many of you have ever, working on something administratively on a machine, kicked off notepad.exe, edit a host file, edit a config file, or whatever? There you go. The other thing, didn't get into my slides, like I was talking about, stealing creds. Couple of fun things, couple of ways to do that. If you can get some level of access, some level of setup on the machine, you can use Meterpreter, load Mimikatz, or, Danny and I were talking about this earlier, is Mimikatz v2, and dump the creds. Even if you don't have full administrative access, you might be able to dump clear text passwords for that user. Could be helpful, especially if they're a domain user. The other thing that I was talking about earlier, and this will help you get local admin on more machines than anything else, is if you in here run a Microsoft domain controller. Really? That's it? Two of you? Two of you only have Microsoft domain controllers in their environments. Exactly. So, of that, how many of you have ever seen users get populated and created and work to workstations via a group policy? Anybody? So, I'm going to say this. I'm going to let it sink in for a minute. You configure a user, you configure the password for that user in group policy, right? It gets pushed out. If any of you have ever set up or configured a domain controller, how many times have you ever actually gone in and configured the key that's used to encrypt that data? Anybody? Anybody ever set that key?
I said it.
You did? So
Is it the Hackney key?
no,
Oh,
the
never mind.
key. So what I said was domain controllers. How have you ever seen an account or a scheduled task or some other process that requires a username and a password that gets pushed out via group policy?
Yeah. You can tell it to run as a different user.
Or you can say, set the local administrator account on every machine to this password.
Yep.
Or how many of you have said, I need a scheduled task or I've got a scheduled process that needs to run on every machine. Or I create a build domain account on the build, but I need to add it to the local administrator group for every machine. And it needs these credentials.
Yeah, you can do that.
How many of you, and I'm going to ask this again, how many of you in here have gone in and configured the key that encrypts or obfuscates that password? Really?
Possibly. I don't know.
They don't teach
It's
you
been a
that.
while.
I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that, hey, you need to go do this.
You can't.
You can't.
No.
Then I haven't.
Yeah.
I changed my answer.
Why.
So luckily, I don't have it up anymore. So here's the fun thing. Due to antitrust lawsuits and all the bullshit that blew up with Microsoft on this, Microsoft was required to expose APIs and document how they work. Because of that, Microsoft, up until just recently, it's now blocked. You're not supposed to be able to do it in the UI. You still can if they haven't would allow you to go in and configure this user, click OK, go on your merry way. So as an authenticated user to the domain, any authenticated user on your domain can access the sysvol. So you go whack whack DC whack sysvol. You're going to get a bunch of GLIDs. Those are your different policies. In there, if you've pushed anything that has pushed a user or pushed a user to a group, you're going to get what's called a groups.xml file. You'll get a scheduled task. Can't remember the specific name on it, but what you will find in there is it'll say the letter C, password. It's in ciphertext. However, that key, because of the antitrust lawsuits, was required to be exposed. It was a 32-bit AES key that is now trivial with the several tools. Metasploit's got a module for it. In Linux, Backtrack, Kali, type GPP and put in the ciphertext for it. It'll immediately decrypt that stored key.
That's cool.
So let's ask this again. If you've stored that password, right? And let's say you're doing pushing that user to every machine on your domain, or you're pushing that out. How many people, unless you're in very large enterprises that have someone that's incredible with group policy, know how to do WMI filtering and targeting based upon OUs in your GPOs? What happened when that GPO is applied? So what happened to your SQL server that runs your PCI database, your credit card database? Or what happens to your Exchange server? Obviously, it won't happen to the domain controller because domain are local users. You've just now pushed that user, and most likely with administrative privileges, to every network. And so now let's take this one step further. If you have administrative privileges on every machine in the network, even let's say you don't have domain admin privileges, you don't have domain administrator privileges, but I can log into, let's say, an MS SQL box, an Exchange box, or some of if you're in big environments, SharePoint, your DRFS stuff. How many times have you ever seen an account logged in or a process running that has domain administrative privileges on those machines? And if you're doing clustering, you're going to get even a better chance of getting that information. So now I'm logged in as a user to that machine, right? I have a file that's an encoded interpreter shell that I just kick back to my attack box. Load Mimikatz, run dump. Oh, here's all of my creds. There's my domain admin password. You're done. At this point, you've won. There's nothing to stop you from being able to go anywhere on the network. But the first and foremost thing is, if you get onto a machine, a Windows box, let's say so I'm going to put this in a real world scenario that I've seen and I've used. Hop onto a machine on a network. You find a command injection or you find a way to get a public exploit on a Windows, it's part of the domain, but they've got it configured, IIS or whatever, configured correctly to run as a local user. Don't even have a local service account. That's where this type of information comes handy. That I've had to sit down, go through processes, hundreds of services, looking for permissions, looking for what else is running. Once you find that next step, oh, okay, here I can attack this. Now I've attached to a domain process. Once you're at a domain level process on a machine, you can start spawning tasks on other machines, start pivoting and jumping around. You're eventually going to find a machine that is ripe for the taking, whether it be an old 2003 box sitting on the network that someone's forgotten about.
The print server.
The print server. I mean, you name it. Recent test I was just out on, I found an old working 2K box still up on the network. It was a happy dance. That was a win. Even though I didn't need it, that same week we also got the Gibson. They had a machine on the network called the Gibson. And yes, we did hack it.
Just asking for trouble.
Yes, you are. And it was one of the security team servers. That was even more fun. But what I've been trying to say and what I've been trying to show you here is the processes. I mean, let's be honest. How many of you in here have jumped on a box, gotten a shell, oh, get system, enter. I'm bad. No. Because, as I said, those processes, how some of those work, get updated. Get system's not going to work on 2012. Good likelihood it won't work on 2008 R2 that's fully patched. But I guarantee you, take your time, you sit down and look at everything, you're going to find a service, an application that's misconfigured that you can now go ahead and backdoor something. Let it rerun. Patient. But when it reruns, you've got your next level of access and start the process over. It's cyclic. But whatever you do, as I said before, I'm going to say it again, maintain multiple shells. How I break out my shells, I've got my main shell that I spawned it with, that I connected with. I leave that shell alone. I'll spawn one that I work out of, one that I've migrated to other processes, and I spawn a local, if I can get away with it without getting myself into trouble, I'll drop a batch file, hide it in the garbage can. Clear buried deep in the recycler to have that I can access and re-kick off so that I kill one of my shells or kill two of my shells, I can respawn that multiple times, have more shells. Because if you've killed your way in, especially, for example, I'll go back to the MS-08067. A lot of times when you exploited that, after the first exploit, it kills the service. You cannot re-exploit it until that machine is rebooted or those services are restarted. Some machines it'll let you, depends on the patch level, depends on how gentle you are with that exploitation. But if you've lost that was your only way in, what happens? You're done. So
You call service desk and tell them to go reboot the computer.
you know what? The funny story about that, we actually just had a test. No good way to escalate privileges. We could run applications. So what we did is we logged onto the machine, had a regular user that was on it. We downloaded the EICAR file. Anybody know what that is? It's the antivirus test signature file that they use to ensure that their AV product is working. It's not malicious. It won't do anything. But it will always alert on 99% of most antiviruses. What happens when you set that in a loop to download 100 times?
Trigger alerts.
you're going to trigger a hell of a lot of alerts. And if you have a good admin, what are
Go home.
well, yes. Okay, let's take an exceptional admin then. Someone that's actually doing his job and not just pretending to be there to get a paycheck.
Go
What?
check it out.
He's going to go check it out.
Response.
He logs in. Oh, we just caught your creds as you logged in. We keylogged you. And then we move on from there.
What was that file called?
It's the EICR, if I remember. Long story short, as I said, it's just a test file. If you can force an admin to log in, this is where the patience pays off. You know, again, if this was a Unix Linux environment for me, and again, this is my opinion, it's much quicker. I can enumerate a lot of things. There's better tools written for privilege escalation against Linux. I can start to see what's running a lot quicker. I can find exploits for those a lot quicker. And generally speaking, you get version numbers very quickly. You know, good or bad, Microsoft devs and a lot of these third-rate app developers out there don't update this shit. So you log into a server or web app or whatever. You're running 2.x or 2.2. They have a version, but you know they've pushed 6 minor code revisions that will make it different because that exploit was fixed in 2.2.2.5. You know, and they're running 2.2.2.6. So you don't know.
Do you keep hashes of them? Insanity, or
I generally don't.
so you could be like, do you hash it? So if you see it again, you'd be like, well, it'll probably work again, right?
I don't, because Windows does have the ability to do some of the hashing on it. You can check it. It's not as reliable on Linux machines. And once you start transferring it over the network, yes, it should come back to the same hash. But, you know, you never know. And depending upon if they have DLP, if they have anything else, they start seeing, you know, EXEs across the network. They start flagging it and they start dropping it.
So so the Windows shell doesn't have a built-in MD5 sound or something?
It, hell, I can't even remember. Nope. Nothing that it sees. No, that's the other thing about the Windows shell and command prompt stuff. And it's the same thing in Unix. This is just general across the board. Do not use relative paths. Use absolute paths for everything if you can. That reason being, I'm going to ask, anybody have an idea why that would be?
Because you never know what exe you're going to be using.
Close. So in Unix, Linux, Windows, everything I've ever seen, how does it determine? So, you know, I'm on a Linux machine and I type Python, right? Hit enter. I'm just dropped in, right?
Yeah, it's included in your path.
It's included in your path. Which Python did you run?
Depends, it could be
Default.
2.6, 2.7.
Well, it depends on
Whatever.
which one's
Yeah.
in the
Whatever's default.
hierarchy.
Yeah.
How is the path hierarchy figured? How does it?
Local directory first.
Local directory first. If it doesn't see it in its local directory,
Not quite sure after that.
It-
Path.
well, so it takes local directory first. You look at your local directory. If it's not present, it starts at the first of the path and it iterates through every directory. So what happens if I drop in root, or so, you know, the root of the Linux file system, right? A Python. And you type Python. And root is the first one in the directory in your path structure.
I'll execute that.
It'll execute that one first instead of the one that's in user bin Python. Or, you know, a good example of this is and this is also goes into executables, and this is getting a little bit outside of what I would tell you to do with this information, unless you're getting real hard up, is you can, dump strings, dump information against actually compiled executables, right? And pull, you'll start to see, they're calling this, they're calling that in there. In a class I took, there was no other escalation points. However, there was a service that ran as root that we could not modify. We had no way to modify it. However, we ran strings against that service. In there, they were using relative paths to call an application. We had write permissions to the directory. So, when that service kicked off the next time, as root, it looked at its local directory first. It found that application that we put there instead of going through the full path. It allowed our code to execute. We got a shell as root. We won. It was game over. You can do the same thing against Windows. If they don't use the absolute path on, so I've seen Windows executables that'll call cmd.exe to do stuff with IIS registration for applications, certificate work, PKI work. I've seen it do all sorts of things. If it just calls cmd.exe and it doesn't call c:\windows/system/cmd.exe, you can drop a cmd.exe in that directory and it'll execute yours. Why permissions are so critical. And that's Windows, Linux, whatever. Those are the things that on a Linux machine you do an ls-la on a directory, you see it real quick. You in here know how to actually check from a command line the Windows permissions on a directory.
Is it attrib?
Nope.
I don't know on the command line.
CACLS. We'll go c:\Windows. Here's your Windows permissions. Can you guys see that okay?
No, I will take your word for it.
So what it'll say, right, it's NT Service Trusted Installer. Has full permissions. NT Service Trusted Installers. These are some of the special permissions, change, modify if you're the owners group, blah, blah, blah. NT Authority System has change, systems, that. Built-in, so anything that's prefaced with NT Service, NT Authority, you're probably not going to be able to touch. But now, and you're not going to be part of unless you're already system, at which point this is pointless. But here's where you start looking. You'll see, it'll say here, built-in users, :R. We have read. Built-in administrators, change. Again, special permissions on owners files and creators files. We have full permissions. Built-in users, special access, generic read, generic execute. We can execute these, but under our own context. We can't execute them as an elevated context unless we provide credentials to that. And that, I'm sorry, is a real pain. How many of you want to go sit down, do a right-click, properties on every folder and file?
Script it. Right?
Nah, even easier.
Would you hit it?
Asterisk, c:\Windows/asterisk. Or, realistically, this would be, let's say, program files /MSSQL or MySQL/asterisk. Now you've got a permission list on all your local files. Without the asterisk, you're doing it against the directory. That'll start to tell you what's going on. So here, write.exe, built-in have read. NT Authority systems read, built-in administrators read, only the entrusted installer has full permissions. You've got to actually look. And I hate to say it, As I said, I spent 8 years or so doing very in-depth Microsoft stuff. I still can't even remember what all the special permissions are. It's kind of a pain. There's newer tools. There's a little bit more non-cryptic. There's better ways to do it with PowerShell. But as you're attacking things, you may not have all the time in the world to pick everything up. So these are very simple, very basic, very quick to get you an idea of what you need. So, good time. Any questions? Anything anybody would like to hear more about? Things that I look for, things I do, breaking these types of systems for work, things to avoid. Any questions on YouTube?
No, they're like 30 seconds behind, so.
So, I mean, when you first start, what's your go-to? What's the first thing you check? Like, what's your go-to thing always?
So, first thing I sit down, I look who I am, what groups I'm a part of. And am I a local or am I a domain? First command I always run is set. I want to know what the hell's going on. This gives me number of processors, gives me what vert OS, gives me, here's my path. Here's the path extension. That's one other thing I was going to mention earlier. If it's got one of these extensions, it will automatically execute it and run it. You don't have to specify the program. It's a registered extension within the OS. I know where my program files are, where things are running, my PowerShell stuff, what my logon server is right here. I know I'm logged into a local machine, most likely into a local machine. That's the first thing. That just gives me a baseline of the system. And then from there, I start looking at, what system info, what patches are installed. I'll take and dump a list of every patch, and I'll go start searching those patches. It sucks. And I start cross-referencing it to known exploits on the OS. Okay, this is this, this is this, this is this. And I'll start looking. For an example, port 445, MS08 067, the standard old. You can block that access to that port externally. So I may have gotten a Windows 2003 machine, web server, but I can't access port 445 remotely. Like I said, if I have permissions and I have, let's say, PowerShell, you can use PowerShell to actually download a file immediately and write it to the machine. I'll put an interpreter shell on there, or I'll dump plink.exe, which is buy and go-to tools that I use a lot. I'll dump it on there. I'll do an SSH port forward, and I'll set up, port 4445 on my local machine over that tunnel back to the machine I'm attacking. For that, and I'll launch the exploit, for example, MS08067, at my local machine at that port and run it across the tunnel. And then kick that shell back and listen on a different port. The fact of the matter is, with Windows exploitation, there's two real distinct environments out there. You've got people that don't know what they're doing, don't know how to do Windows correctly. And this is why Windows gets such a bad rap. Don't know how to configure it correctly, don't know what they're doing. Services, processes, everything runs with an administrative level privilege. They're not using UAC. They're not doing things like that. They make it real easy. But once I'm on the machine, when I first exploited the machine, I've got system level privileges or I've got admin level privileges. I can dump the CRUDs, and away I go, and I walk off. It's simple. You got the other end of the machine, where it is so locked down. I've gotten on machines, I can't run cmd.exe. I can't run PowerShell.exe. I can't run batch files. And it's a I can run Internet Explorer. Okay, can I do something with Internet Explorer? Can I use that to leverage something else? Can I use that to attack another machine? To spawn something on another machine that then allows me to come back to this machine to continue to escalate my privileges. There are environments like that I've worked in that it's just, I'll spend looking at data, looking at network traffic, looking at, scans for these machines, and there's theoretical vulnerabilities. There have been ones in DNS, the DNS service. There's been theoretical vulnerabilities. Bypass authentication for RDP as any user you want. They've patched all the stuff for your patch and that type of stuff, and it's just a matter of finding that one misconfiguration, a service, a running process that's been misconfigured on one machine that you're able to then backdoor it, and then it's a game of sit and wait. Or can you forcibly cause the machine to reboot? Which I have done. I have intentionally crashed important machines on networks to gain access. Or I've broken things intentionally, denial of service them, so that the admin log in and reboot it to try to fix the process. So that when it rebooted, what I had backdoored runs. That's your only way to do it. It's a wide gambit of things.
So we have a question. We use IPC $ shares to gain basic permission Windows 7 machines.
IPC dollar, null sessions if it's and enumeration. If it's configured correctly, no. However, if the domain is not at the right function, if it's not at 2003 functional level, not configured to allow anonymous or null sessions, you can theoretically still enumerate with those. A great tool on runs this is called enum for Linux. You go with a null session and gain some information, some knowledge, enumerate the machine to an extent. If you can get an user account, even a basic user account, especially on a domain, you've hit a jackpot, because your domain controllers are set to allow a user to log in, correct? You may not be able to authenticate and have an interactive desktop on a domain controller. You take enum for Linux, you fire that at the domain controller with valid user credentials. Here's some information that gets dumped. Users. How many local users are on a domain controller? Exactly right. There are no local users. By default, when you do a DC promo on a server, all local users are immediately converted or wiped out, and the administrator user is converted to your domain administrator account. So, if there's no local users and you're going to dump users from that machine, what user base did you just dump? Your entire AD domain. You've just dumped every user. You know every username. You know information about them. You get groups. You can see permissions. So, an engagement I was just on, they were so uptight about the way they did their permissions and who had access to what, and rightfully so, that there were groups in their domain called SVR underscore server name underscore ADM, or SVR underscore server name underscore USR, regular users. I think there was about 500 groups in this domain. and there are that many users within this domain. Given that, I hit enum for Linux against their domain controller, dumped the users, dumped all their groups. It dumps their password policies. It dumps any sort of usable information with like net view, net share, net user, net computer, all that information. It dumps all that information from the domain controller back for parsing. So that tool can be used, as I said, where we got started with this, is with or without credentials. Without credentials, if they have null session set up and they haven't configured it correctly, yeah, you can get some of this information against a server. If they've screwed up their domain controller badly, you can do it against the domain controller. This also works if they haven't configured Samba correctly. You can enumerate a Linux machine the same way. Any other questions? Things people would like to know? Some in areas I can dive back in more on and give more detail that didn't maybe have enough? Anything else on IRC?
No.
No? Okay, well, if that's the case,
Thank you.